Okay, hey, welcome back, guys. This is part two of the chapter 8 video. So, in part one, I kind of explained most of the concepts of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now, I just have a few more slides to show you, mostly where we're just going to talk about some of the graphs that are in the book and some real world examples of things. So, this graph, or this pair of graphs, is like the one we ended on in the last video. So, the graph on the left is showing you the labor market. It has real wage on the vertical axis and employment on the horizontal axis. The graph on the right is showing you aggregate demand and aggregate supply and sort of what's going on in the economy as a whole. So this one is trying to show you an example of a recessionary gap or a recession. Most people just call it recession, but your book calls it recessionary gap, indicating there's sort of a gap or out of equilibrium. But what's going on here, if you start with the graph on the right, is that aggregate demand has decreased. So we started at the aggregate demand that's further to the right where we're at equilibrium, and then it shifts to the left, aggregate demand decreases, and you can see that that pushes the average price level down because there's less spending in the economy. You're going to get surpluses of goods, and businesses will have to lower their prices. But then in the graph on the left, in the labor market, the assumption is that wages a lot of times don't drop when other prices do. A lot of people have unions that protect them, and the unions won't allow wage cuts, or just people in general are resistant to taking cuts in their pay. So even though theory predicts prices are supposed to fall, a lot of times wages actually don't. So the wage rate in the graph on the left remains at W1, and therefore the quantity demanded drops while the quantity supplied stays the same or even increases. But there becomes what would that be? A surplus of labor, which is unemployment. So that's really just showing you an example of unemployment. But the reason for that unemployment partly is that wages are sticky. The book talks a lot about sticky prices and sticky wages. The fact that wages are sticky, especially in the downward direction, they don't like to fall, is part of why we get unemployment during a recession. Okay, so here's an inflationary gap, kind of the same setup. Aggregate demand started at the level on the left where we were at equilibrium, but then aggregate demand shifted to the right. So maybe an increase in consumer confidence or an increase in government purchases, something like that, increases aggregate demand. Again, that pushes average price level up. And again, the wage rate in the graph on the left started at W1, in theory should rise to WE, but again it doesn't, because wages often are one of those things that are kind of sticky and don't move. So in this case you have a quantity demanded for labor that exceeds the quantity supplied. So it's like a shortage in the labor market. There are businesses out there trying to hire like crazy and they don't have enough people to come to work. So basically that's what's going on. All right, so that's inflation. I guess I should add that if that situation persists where the quantity demanded of labor exceeds quantity supplied, eventually those wages should rise. But for a period of time, you might get this inflationary gap. Okay, this is showing you the effect of changes in aggregate demand in the long run. So in the previous slide, previous couple of slides, we looked at some aggregate demand shifts in the short run and saw that they can actually cause increases and decreases in real GDP. But if you just take either one of those examples, let's say we have the inflationary, we'll say there's inflation where there's an inflationary gap, price levels rise, but in the short run, wages do not, and maybe some other prices as well. So businesses in that situation are going to be very profitable. They might actually increase their production due to that for a short period of time. So that was the reason for the positive sloping short run aggregate supply curve. But in the long run, all those prices will adjust. Wages will increase, factor prices will increase, and that will bring us back to our long run aggregate supply curve, which is vertical, only just at a much higher price level. So in that example that I just walked through, we went from AD1 to AD2, and we just basically moved straight up the long run aggregate supply curve. So here's the key point here, if you didn't follow all that. The classical economists, the new classical economists, and even the monetarists have basically told us that government efforts to influence the economy are pointless, and that economic stimulus only causes inflation. And in the long run, that may be true, but in the short run, it may not. So remember that one of the key differences between the Keynesian and classical economists was the classical guys always focus on the long run. They say, yeah, in the long run, this just causes inflation. But remember Keynes' famous quote, in the long run, we're all dead. The point being, in the short run, there are things that the government can do sometimes to prevent people's suffering, to get them back to work, prevent them from losing their houses and things like that. So just kind of a little bit of a political debate there, I guess, among the different types of economists. But it is basically true, I think, that changes in aggregate demand in the long run don't really have any effect on real GDP, but in the short run they can, and that may be important. It's a very similar story here. This is a little more complicated graph, but it's showing you we start out at AD1 and SRAS1 at equilibrium. This example in the book refers to an increase in government purchases, but it could be any type of spending increase. That increases aggregate demand, pushes the price level up to P2. In the short run, that might cause real GDP to increase, but in the long run, all those prices will adjust. Short run aggregate supply will shift back to the left to SRAS2 and the higher equilibrium and the higher price at P3. So this is kind of just combining the last couple of slides into one. Very similar story here. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip that one. I'm going to show you this. So this is the first problem in exercise 8.1. I did it for you just to show you a graph as well. The situation is terrorist attacks in major U.S. cities, so consumer confidence falls. Remember, that's one of the things that affects C, consumer spending, which is a component of aggregate demand. So the direction of shift is going to be left. Aggregate demand would fall. If you were to actually draw this on the graph, you'd see that would cause output or real GDP to decrease and the average price level also to decrease. So my explanation for that is down at the bottom. That's how you do exercise 8.1. I hope that helps. My 3-year-old's after me, so I better go. All right, thanks.